As we drift back into the ancient world, let your thoughts settle among the stone columns of Athens. The air is warm and dry, scented with olive trees and distant fires. The golden age of Athens, marked by Pericles and the Parthenon, has faded. The Peloponnesian War has taken its toll. Political turbulence and shifting power defined the Greek world in the 4th century BCE. It is a time of philosophical inheritance and transformation. This is the world into which Aristotle was born, in 384 BCE, in the Macedonian city of Stagira. His birthplace was not the heart of the Greek world, but rather a peripheral town under the influence of Macedon, a kingdom viewed with skepticism by the more civilized Athenians. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician to the Macedonian king, and so Aristotle's early life was steeped in observation, study, and the biological knowledge of the medical tradition. This early exposure would later shape his deeply empirical orientation, one rooted in the careful study of the natural world, of living things, of causes and purposes. At the age of 17, Aristotle traveled to Athens, the intellectual center of Greece, and joined Plato's academy. The academy was a place unlike any other, a sanctuary for discussion, theory, and metaphysical inquiry. Here, Plato taught his philosophy of eternal forms, unchanging ideals that stood above the physical world. Aristotle remained in the academy for 20 years, absorbing Plato's teachings, yet quietly developing his own distinct views. Though a devoted student, Aristotle began to part ways with his teacher on key issues. Where Plato trusted in reason's ascent beyond the senses, a world of ideal forms only visible to the intellect, Aristotle insisted that knowledge must begin with what is seen, touched, and experienced. He was, in the deepest sense, a naturalist. For him, philosophy was not an escape from the physical world, but an effort to understand it more completely. Still, his respect for Plato endured. After Plato's death in 347 BCE, Aristotle was passed over for leadership of the academy, and he left Athens. He traveled first to Assos and then to Lesbos, where he conducted groundbreaking studies in biology and marine life. But it was his return to Macedon, and a most unusual role, that would forever link him with history. Aristotle was appointed tutor to a young prince named Alexander, the boy who would become Alexander the Great. Let your thoughts rest on this moment, the greatest philosopher of the age, guiding the mind of a future conqueror. Aristotle sought to instill in Alexander the values of reason, moderation, and Greek culture, and yet the tides of power often run deeper than education. In his years with the Macedonian court, Aristotle occupied a space both privileged and precarious. To be tutor to Alexander meant influence, but also proximity to power's unpredictable currents. Though the full extent of Aristotle's impact on the young prince remains uncertain, their relationship symbolized a merging of intellectual and imperial ambition. Where Plato had dreamed of philosopher kings, Aristotle found himself at the elbow of a future emperor. Alexander would go on to conquer vast swathes of the known world, from Egypt to the Indus Valley, establishing one of the largest empires in history. His military genius reshaped the map, but the cultural legacy of his conquests ran deeper. Greek language, ideas, and customs spread across continents. This period, later known as the Hellenistic Age, was marked not only by territorial expansion, but by the export of Greek philosophy, science, and art. Aristotle's influence, then, was not confined to the lecture hall. It moved with the armies, the traders, the scholars who followed Alexander's path. And yet, Aristotle himself was no conqueror. His life was rooted in thought, in patient observation, in classification, in the desire to understand the world as it is. Around 335 BCE, with Alexander now king and Aristotle's position secure, he returned to Athens. But this time, he did not rejoin the academy. Instead, he established his own school, the Lyceum. The Lyceum was different from Plato's academy in both style and spirit. It was less mystical, more methodical. Aristotle's students walked with him as he taught, and so they were called peripatetics, those who walk around. The lessons ranged widely, from logic and rhetoric to biology and politics, from ethics to astronomy. Aristotle's intellect was encyclopedic, and his method was grounded in categorization and clarity. Unlike Plato's dialogues, which unfolded in dramatic conversation, Aristotle's works often read like lecture notes, precise, structured, analytical. In the Lyceum, Aristotle undertook one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in history, to create a systematic account of all human knowledge. He did not confine philosophy to abstract speculation. Instead, he asked how everything works: nature, society, thought itself. The Lyceum became a center for empirical study, its grounds filled with specimens, scrolls, and eager minds. It was the world's first true research university. But history is not without irony. Though Aristotle had returned in peace, his Macedonian ties would later endanger him. In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died suddenly in Babylon. Anti-Macedonian sentiments surged in Athens, and Aristotle, despite his legacy, despite his contributions, found himself under suspicion. Accused of impiety, the same charge that had condemned Socrates, he fled the city. "I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy," he is said to have remarked. He died a year later, in exile, at the age of 62. As we breathe slowly and reflect on Aristotle's journey, it becomes clear that he did not emerge in isolation. He stood at a pivotal crossroads in the history of Western thought, a transitional figure between the idealism of Plato and the coming age of practical, systematic reasoning. To understand his place in this lineage, we must briefly glance both backward and forward. Philosophy in the ancient Greek world had already passed through several important stages. The pre-Socratics, thinkers like Thales, Heraclitus, and Parmenides, had speculated on the nature of the cosmos: water, fire, change, unity. Then came Socrates, who turned philosophy inward, toward questions of ethics and the examined life. Plato, Socrates' student, elevated those inquiries into a grand metaphysical vision of forms, unchanging realities that transcended the material world. Aristotle inherited all of this: the cosmology, the ethics, the metaphysics, but he recast it in a new mold. He respected Plato deeply, often referring to him simply as the philosopher, yet his thinking was radically different. Where Plato sought eternal truths in a separate realm, Aristotle looked for them in the world around him. His was a philosophy of immanence rather than transcendence. Ideas, for Aristotle, did not float in a higher plane. They were embedded in things, discoverable through observation and reason. This shift marked a turning point. Plato's academy had cultivated a somewhat mystical, abstract approach to truth. Aristotle's Lyceum, by contrast, represented the beginnings of systematic science. He dissected animals, classified plants, analyzed political systems, studied rhetoric and logic, always searching for causes, patterns, principles. In this way, Aristotle laid the foundations not only for Western philosophy, but for biology, physics, logic, literary criticism, and political science. It's easy from a modern perspective to overlook how revolutionary this was. In an age still steeped in mythology and oral tradition, Aristotle insisted on structure, evidence, and coherence. He believed that everything had a purpose, a function toward which it naturally moved, and that the task of philosophy was to discern this natural order. He called it telos, the end, the goal, the reason why a thing is what it is. And yet, for all his analytical rigor, Aristotle was not a cold thinker. He wrote of friendship and virtue, of the good life and human flourishing. His concept of eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or well-being, is not about fleeting pleasure, but about a life well lived, balanced, rational, and virtuous. He saw philosophy not as a retreat from the world, but as a way to engage with it more fully. With the end of Aristotle's life, a chapter of philosophy quietly closed, But what he left behind was monumental. His writings would be lost and rediscovered, forgotten and revived, debated and revered for over 2 millennia. He was not only a bridge between Plato and future thinkers, but a living link between speculative thought and practical inquiry, between mythos and logos, between metaphysics and the real world. His life had unfolded across 2 vastly different settings, from the philosophical gardens of Athens to the halls of Macedonian power. He had studied under a man who sought truth in eternal forms, and tutored one who sought dominance across the earth. Aristotle's ability to stand in both worlds, the abstract and the political, the contemplative and the empirical, defined his legacy. He was not a dreamer like Plato, nor a mystic like Pythagoras. He was, above all, a realist, but one with vision. In many ways, Aristotle's era represents the last breath of classical Greek independence. After his death in 322 BCE and Alexander's a year earlier, the Hellenistic period began in earnest, a time when Greek culture and language spread widely, but Greek democracy and autonomy declined. Philosophy too would change, adapting to new audiences and new concerns. The Stoics, Epicureans, and Skeptics, the next wave of thinkers, would speak to individuals navigating a changing world, often less concerned with abstract truth and more with peace of mind. And yet, Aristotle's influence persisted. His school, the Lyceum, continued under his students. His collected works, though at times fragmentary and uneven, became a treasure trove for future generations. Centuries later, Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Christian thinkers in medieval Europe would reintroduce Aristotle's logic, ethics, and metaphysics to new audiences, often placing him alongside or even above Plato in importance. But all of that is still to come. For now, as we draw breath at the end of this historical context, we prepare ourselves for the core of Aristotle's philosophy, his vision of how we come to know, what exists, how we should live, and what makes life beautiful or just. If Plato offered us the dream of philosophy, Aristotle gives us its architecture. Let your thoughts settle now as we leave the dusty roads of Macedon, the lecture halls of Athens, and the war campaigns of Alexander. In the silence of this moment, we arrive at the threshold of Aristotle's thought, built stone by stone, question by question, from the ground beneath our feet. We turn now to the Epistemology of Aristotle. Aristotle's approach to knowledge stands in direct contrast to that of his teacher, Plato, where Plato taught that true knowledge comes from recollecting ideal forms, perfect, abstract versions of things we perceive. Aristotle begins not in a realm beyond the senses, but with the senses themselves. For Aristotle, there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. We come to know the world not by remembering higher realities, but by carefully observing the one we live in. Knowledge, he believed, is built from the ground up. We perceive objects with our senses, and from these perceptions we form memories. When memories accumulate and patterns begin to emerge, our minds abstract from them something more lasting, experience. And from experience, we rise gradually to universal knowledge, the kind of understanding that underlies science and philosophy. This process is not sudden or mystical. It is incremental, like building a structure brick by brick. For Aristotle, the senses are trustworthy guides. They may not give us absolute truth, but they are our best and only path to it. Unlike Plato, who saw the material world as a shadow of reality, Aristotle believed the world around us is real, knowable, and intelligible. Truth is not hidden in another realm. It is discoverable here and now through reasoned inquiry. He introduces the concept of induction, a process of moving from particular observations to general conclusions. If we observe many individual instances of something behaving a certain way, we may come to infer a rule or principle that explains them. This stands as one of the earliest foundations of the scientific method. But Aristotle doesn't stop there. He also provides the framework for deductive reasoning, most famously through his invention of formal logic. His syllogism, a logical argument in which a conclusion follows necessarily from two premises, is a cornerstone of rational thought. For example, all humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. It may seem simple now, but this structure allowed Aristotle to show how knowledge could be built systematically, each truth resting securely on prior truths. It was a revolution in clarity and coherence. For Aristotle, knowledge, or episteme, means understanding not just that something is true, but why it is true. To truly know, we must understand the causes behind things, and that leads us directly into one of Aristotle's most influential contributions to epistemology and science, his theory of causes. To truly understand a thing, Aristotle believed, we must ask not just what it is or how it behaves, but why it is the way it is. This why question is not answered by a single cause, but by four different kinds of causes that together explain the full nature of any object or phenomenon. The material cause. This is what something is made of. For example, a statue is made of marble. The material cause tells us the substance that underlies the object. The formal cause. This is the shape, pattern, or essence of the thing. What makes a statue and not a pile of stone? It refers to the design or structure, the defining characteristics. The efficient cause. This is what brings the thing into being. In our example, the sculptor is the efficient cause, the agent or process that shapes the material into its form. The final cause. This is perhaps the most distinctively Aristotelian. It refers to the purpose or end, telos, for which a thing exists. The final cause of the statue may be to honor a god, to express beauty, or to commemorate a person. Together, these four causes form a comprehensive explanation. Modern science tends to emphasize material and efficient causes, what something is made of and what produced it. But Aristotle insists that to truly understand something, we must grasp all four: the substance, the form, the process, and the purpose. This way of thinking permeates all his work. Whether he's studying animals, politics, or ethics, Aristotle is always asking, what is this thing's nature? What is it trying to become? What is its proper function? In Aristotle's view, knowledge is never static. Things are always in motion, always becoming. He introduces the concept of potentiality and actuality. A seed is not yet a tree, but it has the potential to become one. The acorn contains within it the pattern of the oak. The process of change, of unfolding one's nature toward a final form, is central to how Aristotle understands the world. And so, epistemology for Aristotle is not just a matter of collecting data. It is about seeing into the essence and purpose of things. To know something is to know what it is made of, what brought it into being, and what it is meant to do. Knowledge in this way is not cold or detached. It is an intimate understanding of the natural order. As we drift now from thought to thought, we carry with us the sense that truth begins with the senses, but ends in wisdom, a kind of clarity that draws the soul toward meaning. As we ease into the heart of Aristotle's thought, we arrive at the realm he called first philosophy, what we today refer to as metaphysics. This is the study of being as such, the fundamental nature of reality, beyond the changing world of appearances. If epistemology tells us how we come to know, metaphysics tells us what is. Unlike Plato, who posited a separate, immaterial realm of perfect forms, Aristotle insists that the real world is not an illusion or copy. It is not merely a shadow of something greater. The world we perceive is real, and it is intelligible. Its patterns and principles can be grasped by reason, and they do not reside in some distant heaven. They are embedded in things themselves. At the core of Aristotle's metaphysics is the concept of substance. Substance is what exists independently, what has being in the fullest sense. A tree, a horse, a human being, these are substances. They are more than the sum of their parts. Substance is that which underlies all change. It persists through time, even as its attributes vary. To make sense of this, Aristotle distinguishes between two key ideas: form and matter. Every physical object, he says, is a compound of matter and form. Matter is the potential, the stuff something is made of. Form is the actuality, the organization, shape, or structure that makes a thing what it is. Think of a marble statue. The marble is the matter, shapeless, undirected, full of potential. The sculpted figure is the form, the principle that gives the statue its identity. Without form, matter is just raw possibility. Without matter, form is an abstraction. Only together do they make a real, individual thing. This view, that form and matter are always united, stands in sharp contrast to Plato. For Plato, the form of a horse existed in a timeless realm, separate from any actual horse. For Aristotle, the form of the horse exists in the horse. It is immanent, not transcendent. This is a profound shift. It brings metaphysics back down to earth, but Aristotle goes further. He is not only interested in what things are made of, but in how they change, how things come into being, persist, and pass away. To explain this, he develops a theory of potentiality and actuality, which we touched on in Epistemology, but which plays a central role here. Everything in nature, Aristotle says, is moving from potentiality to actuality. A seed has the potential to become a tree, a child the potential to become an adult, a lump of clay the potential to become a vase. Change is not chaotic, it is directed, purposeful. It is the realization of a form that was already within. At the heart of Aristotle's metaphysics lies one of his most profound and enduring ideas, the unmoved mover. It emerges from his attempt to understand not only individual change, like the growth of a tree or the movement of the stars, but the very existence of motion and causality in the universe. If everything in nature is moved or changed by something else, then we are left with a logical problem. What started the chain of motion? What is the cause behind all causes? A first cause that itself is not caused by anything else. Aristotle's answer is elegant. There must be a prime mover, something that causes motion without itself being moved. This he calls the unmoved mover. Unlike the gods of mythology, who act out passions and whims, the unmoved mover is not a creator in a personal or mythological sense. It does not intervene, nor does it will the world into existence. Instead, it acts as a kind of final cause, a pure actuality toward which all things strive. The unmoved mover is perfect, eternal, and immaterial. It does not move by force, but by attraction, like beauty drawing the eye or love drawing the heart. The heavens, in Aristotle's cosmology, revolve in eternal motion because they are striving toward this perfection. It is the highest object of thought, and its activity is pure contemplation. In Aristotle's famous phrase, the unmoved mover is thought thinking itself. This might seem abstract, even mystical, and in some ways it is, but it reflects Aristotle's deep conviction that the universe is intelligible, ordered, and purposive. The unmoved mover stands as the ultimate explanation of that order, not a god of miracles and intervention, but of coherence and completion. From this metaphysical system, Aristotle constructs a layered view of being. Not all things exist in the same way. There are degrees and kinds of being. Substances, individual entities, are the primary mode of being, but there are also accidents, qualities, relations, and states, ways in which things can be or change without altering their essential nature. For example, a man may be young, then old, sitting, then standing, hot, then cold. But through these changes, his underlying substance endures. This careful classification of what it means to be allows Aristotle to explore not only existence, but identity and change. Being is not one single thing, but a web of interconnected realities, each intelligible, each with its cause, each participating in the movement from potential to actual. As we exhale slowly, we might consider this. For Aristotle, to be is not merely to exist, but to unfold. to strive toward one's nature, one's final form. Reality is a tapestry of purpose, of form shaping matter, of motion striving towards stillness, and at its center, quietly, eternally, rests the unmoved mover, the perfect thought that draws all things into being. As we move gently from metaphysics into ethics, we transition from questions about what exists to questions about how we ought to live. For Aristotle, the two are intimately connected. If everything in nature has a purpose, a telos, then human beings must as well. The central question of Aristotle's ethics is simple yet profound. What is the good for human beings? What does it mean to live well? Aristotle's answer begins with a term central to his philosophy, eudaimonia. Often translated as happiness, eudaimonia more accurately means flourishing, fulfillment, or living in accordance with one's nature. It is not a passing feeling of pleasure, nor mere contentment. Rather, it is the condition of a life lived excellently, where all the parts of the soul are in harmony, and a person is fulfilling their potential over time. Every action we take, Aristotle argues, aims at some good. Some goods are instrumental. We pursue them for the sake of something else, like wealth or status. But eudaimonia is different. It is the final end, the thing we seek for its own sake. It is complete, self-sufficient, and the goal toward which all our choices point, even if we are not always aware of it. But how do we achieve this kind of flourishing? Aristotle's answer is grounded in his understanding of human nature. Humans, he says, are rational animals. Our distinctive function, what sets us apart from plants and other animals, is the capacity for reason. Therefore, to live well is to live a life of rational activity in accordance with virtue. This leads us to the heart of Aristotle's ethical thought: virtue, ethics. Virtues for Aristotle are not rules or commandments. They are character traits, dispositions that allow us to act and feel in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. Courage, generosity, temperance, and justice are all virtues, but they are not extremes. In fact, Aristotle famously defines virtue as a mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Take courage, for example. Too little, and one becomes cowardly. Too much, and one becomes reckless. True courage lies in the balanced middle, a steadiness in the face of fear, guided by reason. The same applies to other virtues. Generosity lies between stinginess and extravagance. Modesty lies between shamelessness and undue shyness. This doctrine of the mean does not imply mediocrity. It requires discernment, habit, and emotional education. Virtue is not innate, nor is it acquired by accident. It must be cultivated through practice, reflection, and community. Ethics for Aristotle is not theoretical. It is practical, habitual, and embodied. It concerns what we do, and even more, who we become. To live well, Aristotle tells us, is to live in accordance with virtue, but not in isolation. Human beings are, by nature, social animals, and our flourishing is deeply tied to how we live with others. In one of the most touching and insightful parts of his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle turns to the subject of friendship, philia, and treats it not as a pleasant bonus to a good life, but as a necessary condition of it. There are 3 types of friendship, he writes. 1. Bight fashion of utility, where people associate for mutual benefit, like business partners. 2. Friendships of pleasure, based on enjoyment, like those who share a hobby or passion. 3. And finally, the highest form, friendships of virtue, where 2 individuals wish the good for each other, not because of what they gain, but because of who the other is. This last kind of friendship is rare, but deeply fulfilling. It is a mirror of the self, a space where character is refined and tested. In such a bond, 2 people share in the life of reason and virtue. They grow together. Aristotle even says that a true friend is another self. And yet virtue requires more than goodwill and balance. It requires reason. For Aristotle, the rational soul has two parts. One that listens to reason, as in self-control, and one that exercises it, as in deliberation and choice. When we act virtuously, it is not simply because we feel like doing the right thing. It is because we have learned to want the right thing at the right time for the right reason. This is the essence of practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to choose well in complex, real-world situations. Unlike abstract rules or commandments, Aristotle's ethics is flexible, deeply human. It recognizes that life is unpredictable and nuanced, and that living well requires not just knowing what is good, but becoming the kind of person who naturally acts well. This is why education and habit are so central. We are not born virtuous. We become so by repeated action. A just person is one who acts justly over time. A temperate person is one who learns to master desires, not suppress them, but guide them through reason. And what is the reward of all this effort? A life lived in accordance with one's nature, a life that finds joy in good actions, peace in good character, and fulfillment in a harmony between reason and desire. As you breathe softly now, reflect. For Aristotle, ethics is not about perfection. It is about progress, not about rigid rules, but about the cultivation of a life worth living, a life where thought and action align, and where the soul, in all its layers, moves steadily toward its own flourishing. Following naturally from ethics, Aristotle's political philosophy explores not only how individuals should live, but how we should live together. Just as no one becomes virtuous in isolation, no one flourishes entirely alone. For Aristotle, politics is not separate from ethics. It is ethics writ large. The good life is a social life, and the ideal society is one that supports and cultivates virtue in its citizens. He begins his work, Politics, with a famous assertion: man is by nature a political animal. This does not mean that we are destined for party politics or endless debate, but rather that we are fundamentally social creatures drawn naturally toward association, cooperation, and shared purpose. The basic unit of human society is the family. Families come together to form villages, and villages eventually grow into the polis, the city-state. This is the most complete form of community, Aristotle says, because it exists not merely for survival or convenience, but for the sake of living well. It is in the polis that humans can reach their full potential, not just as individuals, but as citizens engaged in a shared moral and intellectual life. For Aristotle, the purpose of the state is to cultivate virtue among its people. Laws, education, customs, these are all tools to help citizens live in accordance with reason and justice. Politics, therefore, is not about power or wealth, but about creating conditions in which human flourishing becomes possible. But Aristotle is not utopian. He recognizes that political life is complex, and that not all constitutions are created equal. He classifies governments into three right forms, and their corresponding deviant forms. Monarchy, rule by one for the good of all. Aristocracy, rule by the virtuous few. Polity, a constitutional government, rule by the many, guided by law. Each of these, when corrupted, becomes tyranny. Monarchy turns self-serving. Amaran oligarchy, rule by the wealthy few for their own gain. Democracy, rule by the many in pursuit of pleasure rather than virtue. His preferred form is a polity, a mixed constitution that balances the interests of rich and poor, guided by a stable middle class and bound by laws rooted in the common good. What matters most for Aristotle is not the exact structure, but the aim of the political system. Does it promote virtue? Does it allow people to live well? Does it foster a sense of justice, friendship, and shared purpose? Politics, like ethics, is about realizing human potential, not in solitude, but in the rhythms of daily life, lived among others. If the goal of the polis is to promote the good life, then it must also ask, who is a citizen and what does citizenship require? For Aristotle, a citizen is not simply someone who lives within the borders of a city-state. A true citizen is someone who participates in ruling and being ruled, someone who takes part in deliberation, judgment, and governance. Citizenship is not a passive status, but an active role. It is both a privilege and a responsibility, requiring education, virtue, and engagement in public life. He recognizes that different types of constitutions will produce different kinds of citizens. In a monarchy, one might serve the king. In a democracy, the people rule. But in all cases, the character of the citizen is shaped by the constitution, just as the constitution is shaped by the citizens. It is a reciprocal relationship. A virtuous society requires virtuous individuals, and virtuous individuals are nurtured by a well-ordered society. This leads Aristotle to his enduring concept of justice, which he calls the bond of men in states. Justice, for him, is not just about punishment or law enforcement. It is about giving each person their due, distributing honors, rights, and resources fairly, according to merit and the common good. He distinguishes between stateless tributive justice, concerned with the fair allocation of wealth, power, and responsibility based on contribution or desert, corrective justice, concerned with righting wrongs in private transactions, restoring balance when harm or injustice has occurred. Both are essential for maintaining harmony and fairness in the polis. Without justice, the city fragments. With justice, the parts can work together as a unified whole. Aristotle also emphasizes the importance of law. The law should not be arbitrary or subject to the whims of rulers. It should be rational, stable, and oriented toward the good of the whole. In his ideal polity, the rule of law ensures that citizens do not rule by passion or interest, but in accordance with reason and equity. Yet even the best laws, he warns, cannot make people good on their own. This is why Aristotle sees education as the soul of politics. The young must be taught not only knowledge, but habits of virtue, courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. A state that neglects moral education, he says, is like a potter trying to make beautiful vessels without knowing the art of pottery. Finally, Aristotle does not view political life as a burden or a compromise. It is, at its best, a part of the good life. Just as the individual strives for virtue, so too should the state. When people are educated, engaged, and guided by just laws, the city becomes more than a collection of individuals. It becomes a community of character, a place where human beings can not only survive, but thrive. Finally, we come to aesthetics. Unlike Plato, who famously distrusted art as a seductive imitation that distracts us from truth, Aristotle defends the value of art, particularly poetry, drama, and music, as vital to our emotional and intellectual lives. His key contribution to aesthetics is found in his short but enormously influential work, The Poetics. At the heart of Aristotle's theory of art lies the concept of mimesis, imitation. All art, he says, is in some sense an imitation of life. But unlike Plato, who thought imitation was a pale copy of the real and thus twice removed from truth, Aristotle sees imitation as a natural and noble activity. From childhood, we learn through imitation. It is how we grasp patterns, express emotions, and understand the world. Aristotle argues that art does not simply reflect reality, it reveals it. Art takes the messiness of life and gives it form, structure, and meaning. In doing so, it helps us understand universal truths. A tragedy, for instance, is not just the story of one man's downfall. It is a window into the human condition, the workings of fate, character, and choice. Aristotle is especially interested in tragedy as the highest form of dramatic poetry. In Poetics, he defines tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, using language that is artistically embellished and presented in dramatic, not narrative, form. Its aim is to arouse pity and fear, and to purge these emotions through catharsis. This idea of catharsis, emotional purification or cleansing, is central. By watching tragedy, we confront deep and difficult emotions in a safe and structured space. We are moved, disturbed, and ultimately relieved. It is not about escapism, but transformation. Through art, we experience life more deeply, and in a way, more clearly. The success of a tragedy, Aristotle says, depends on its plot, mythos, not just the characters. A good plot has a beginning, middle, and end. It follows the logic of action, not chronology. It should contain reversal, peripeteia, a change in fortune, and recognition, anagnorisis, a moment of insight or revelation. These dramatic turns intensify the emotional experience and bring the audience into a more profound engagement with the themes of the play. Characters should be relatable but elevated, not perfect, but not entirely base. The tragic hero is often someone of noble stature who possesses a tragic flaw, hamartia, not a moral failing, but an error in judgment. Their fall is not meaningless, it is a moral and emotional lesson. Thus, art, far from being mere decoration, becomes, for Aristotle, a mode of inquiry, a way of knowing the world and ourselves. It teaches us about human nature, emotion, and meaning through the lens of imagination and beauty. While tragedy and poetry dominate Aristotle's Poetics, his thoughts on beauty and music, scattered across several works including the Politics and Rhetoric, reveal a broader aesthetic theory. For Aristotle, beauty is not an abstract ideal floating above the world, as in Plato's thought, but something we experience within the world, bound to order, proportion, and harmony. Beauty arises, he says, when form and function align. A well-crafted object, whether a sculpture, a melody, or a speech, possesses unity in diversity, symmetry, and coherence. A beautiful thing is not merely pleasing to the senses, it reflects the intelligibility of nature. As in his Metaphysics and Ethics, Aristotle finds beauty in purposeful form, in things becoming what they are meant to be. This belief extends naturally into his philosophy of music, which Aristotle considers not just an art, but a moral force. In Book 8 of the Politics, he writes that music has the power to shape the character of the soul. Different modes and rhythms, he argues, arouse different emotions. Some foster courage, others gentleness. Some inspire reflection, others intoxicate. For this reason, Aristotle insists that education must include training in music, not for the sake of entertainment, but for the cultivation of virtue. Unlike Plato, who wanted to strictly censor the arts in his ideal republic, Aristotle takes a more balanced view. Art should not be suppressed, but guided, integrated into education and civic life, in a way that strengthens character and community. Music, poetry, and drama become tools of ethical development, sharpening the emotions and the intellect alike. Aristotle also explores rhetoric, the art of persuasion, as a kind of aesthetic craft. Like poetry and drama, rhetoric involves language shaped for effect, aiming not just at truth, but at emotional resonance and moral insight. A skilled orator moves the soul not by deception, but by speaking to reason and emotion together, using beauty of expression as a bridge between thought and action. Underlying all of this is a vision of the human being as both rational and feeling, a creature moved by thought and stirred by beauty. Art speaks to this duality. It does not merely entertain us, it engages our full humanity. Through the structure of a tragedy, the harmony of music, the rhythm of speech, we encounter the form of human experience, rendered visible and audible. To live well, Aristotle suggests, is not to live without beauty, but to live among it wisely, to let music temper our passions, poetry deepen our understanding, and drama mirror our own struggles and aspirations. As the candlelight of reflection flickers low, we can see that Aristotle's aesthetics is not an isolated branch of philosophy. It is woven into his entire worldview, where form and function, reason and feeling, individual and community, all strive for balance, expression, and purpose. With the final embers of this long reflection still glowing, we step back and consider the extraordinary legacy of Aristotle, a thinker whose ideas have shaped not only philosophy, but the very contours of Western thought for over 2 millennia. Aristotle's influence is almost impossible to overstate. He was not just a philosopher, but a polymath, writing on everything from ethics and politics to biology, logic, physics, psychology, and poetics. His reach spans disciplines and centuries. He created entire fields of study and left behind methods of inquiry that remain foundational even today. In antiquity, Aristotle's thought became central to the Peripatetic school, named for the colonnades of the Lyceum, where he taught while walking and talking with his students. His students continued to compile, preserve, and expand upon his lectures, many of which form the basis of the texts we read today. In the centuries following his death, his work spread across the Hellenistic world. But it was in the Islamic Golden Age that Aristotle was truly rediscovered and revived. Scholars such as Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes ibn Rushd not only preserved Aristotle's writings, but engaged with them deeply, integrating them into a synthesis of Islamic philosophy and science. Through these Arabic commentaries, Aristotle's works re-entered Europe during the medieval period, where he was embraced by Christian theologians and scholars, most notably Thomas Aquinas. In Aquinas' hands, Aristotle became the philosopher, whose writings could be harmonized with Christian doctrine. His metaphysics and ethics provided a rational framework for understanding creation, virtue, and divine order. In many ways, Aristotelian logic and cosmology became the backbone of scholastic thought, yet his influence did not stop there. During the Renaissance, Aristotle's authority was both revered and challenged. Thinkers like Galileo began to push back against some of Aristotle's physics, laying the groundwork for a new empirical science. But even in critique, his methodological rigor and commitment to observation lived on, influencing the scientific method itself. In modern philosophy, Aristotle continues to be a touchstone. His virtue ethics has seen a resurgence, especially in response to the impersonal abstractions of utilitarianism and deontology. His insistence that ethics is about character, context, and human flourishing resonates in a world increasingly seeking a more humane, grounded moral outlook. And in politics too, his ideas echo. His belief in the centrality of the middle class, the importance of education, and the danger of extremes remains relevant in today's political discourse. Aristotle never gave us a utopia. He gave us a lens through which we might understand the conditions for a well-ordered and fulfilling society. From ancient Athens to the digital age, Aristotle's thought has remained astonishingly resilient, not because it provides all the answers, but because it teaches us how to ask the right questions. As we come to the close of our time with Aristotle, let us pause to reflect on the deep stillness and quiet strength his thought offers. His work is not loud. It does not shout for attention, yet it endures, woven gently into the very fabric of how we think, speak, reason, and live. What makes Aristotle so timeless is his moderation, his grounding in the real and the possible. Where Plato soared into the abstract world of forms, Aristotle placed his feet firmly on the earth. He examined life as it is lived, studying nature, society, character, and choice, not to escape this world, but to understand it more clearly. He reminds us that wisdom is not reserved for the exceptional, but is available to anyone who practices reflection, cultivates virtue, and lives in harmony with their purpose. A good life, for Aristotle, is not a divine gift or a stroke of luck. It is the product of habit, community, and reason, something we can all strive for, day by day, choice by choice. In reading him, we are invited into a tradition of thought that values balance over extremism, understanding over certainty, and deliberation over impulse. He teaches us that flourishing, eudaimonia, is not pleasure for its own sake, but a state of being well and doing well in the activity of living. He encourages us to take our nature seriously, to ask not only what we want, but what we are meant to become. Aristotle's enduring image of the human being is not as a perfect or fallen creature, but as a work in progress. A rational animal, yes, but also emotional, social, embodied. His ethics, politics, aesthetics, and science all speak to this view of life as a constant unfolding, where truth is revealed, not just in logic, but in love, art, action, and reflection. His influence stretches far into theology, psychology, biology, linguistics, even economics. And yet, his words remain remarkably personal. They address the reader not as a distant scholar, but as a fellow seeker, someone trying, imperfectly, to live well. And so, as you drift towards sleep, think of Aristotle walking slowly under the trees of the Lyceum, talking with his students, asking questions, always listening. His voice, calm and exacting, urging us to look more carefully, think more clearly, and live more purposefully. May his ideas settle gently in your mind as soft ripples in a quiet pool, giving shape to your thoughts and your dreams. Thank you for joining me tonight for this journey through the life and philosophy of Aristotle. This has been the Great Philosophers ASMR Sleep Series. If you've enjoyed our time together, I hope you'll consider liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Sleep well, and good night.